Imagine this, a fighter plane, ripped apart in midair, a wing torn off by enemy fire, spinning uncontrollably toward the ground. Most pilots in this situation never make it back. But this wasn't most pilots. This was a man driven by skill, determination, and a burning desire for revenge. Today, we're diving deep into the incredible story of a pilot who defied all odds, flew a crippled aircraft, and came back to settle the score. Buckle up, this is a story of courage, precision, and sheer willpower that you won't believe actually happened. It started like any other day in the war zone. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting an eerie glow on the airbase. Our pilot, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Harker, climbed into his fighter jet, a sleek and deadly machine built for speed, precision, and survival. His mission was simple on paper: provide air support for Allied forces and intercept enemy aircraft attempting to breach their lines. But what Jimmy didn't know was that this flight would change his life and his enemy's fate forever. The roar of the engine shook the cockpit as Jimmy soared over enemy territory. He had flown this route hundreds of times, yet today, something felt different, an unsettling tension in the air. The enemy had recently deployed new fighter aircraft, faster and more aggressive than anything Jimmy had encountered. As he scanned the sky, a flash of metal caught his eye, an enemy fighter diving straight for him. The dogfight began. Twisting, turning, and weaving through the clouds, Jimmy fought for every inch of airspace. Then in an instant, disaster struck. A sudden explosion rocked his aircraft. One of the wings had been ripped clean off. Flying without a wing is a death sentence for any pilot. The aircraft immediately began to spin uncontrollably, plummeting toward the earth. In that split second, most pilots would have bailed, but not Jimmy. Something inside him refused to give up. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he fought to stabilize the crippled fighter. He used throttle adjustments, rudder movements, and sheer instinct to slow the spin, pulling the plane into a rough, terrifying glide. Every second felt like an eternity, and every maneuver was a dance with death. The damage was catastrophic, but Jimmy's mind worked with surgical precision. He recalled every training drill, every emergency procedure, every technique for surviving an aircraft with severe structural damage. Using the engine's thrust as his primary control, he managed to keep the plane airborne long enough to regain some semblance of stability. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy, but it was working. The enemy pilots, witnessing the impossible, were dumbfounded. This fighter was defying physics, and the man inside it was defying fate itself. While most pilots would have focused solely on survival, Jimmy had something else on his mind: revenge. One of the enemy aces, a notorious pilot responsible for countless Allied deaths, had to pay. Jimmy knew he couldn't engage in a prolonged dogfight, but with his aircraft's reduced maneuverability, he could strike strategically. Using terrain, cloud cover, and split-second timing, he planned an ambush mid-air, turning desperation into opportunity. His mind was calm, calculated, and lethal, like a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. The enemy ace approached, confident and cocky, thinking that a crippled plane could pose no threat. Jimmy waited, engine screaming, heart pounding, calculating the exact moment to strike. Using the plane's residual speed and a sharp dive, he launched a surprise attack. The enemy didn't see it coming. A direct hit, a flash of fire in the sky, and the enemy fighter spiraled out of control. Revenge had been served, and Jimmy had done it without a wing on his aircraft. Now came the hardest part: returning to base. Every maneuver was precarious, every second a gamble. Jimmy navigated low over forests, rivers, and valleys, minimizing the risk of another enemy attack while fighting the aircraft's instability. Air traffic control, tracking the unusual readings from the damaged jet, watched in awe as he approached the runway. With one final hair-raising descent, Jimmy landed the fighter in a rough but survivable touchdown. The runway erupted in cheers. The impossible had been accomplished. The story of Jimmy Harker spread like wildfire. How had he survived such catastrophic damage? How had he returned not only alive but victorious? His courage became a legend among fellow pilots, a testament to the human spirit's resilience. He didn't just survive, he struck back against overwhelming odds, proving that determination, skill, and a refusal to quit can defy the limits of physics and mortality alike. The explosion had ripped through the fuselage, sending shrapnel into the cockpit. Smoke choked the small cabin, and the smell of burning metal filled Jimmy's nose. Instruments flickered wildly, alarms blaring with a piercing urgency. He gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the control stick until his knuckles turned white. "Stay with me, old girl," he muttered, talking to his plane as if it were alive. Every twist of the rudder, every adjustment to the throttle, was a life-or-death gamble. Outside, the enemy formation circled, expecting a fatal mistake. But Jimmy had other plans. Using a combination of steep dives and engine power adjustments, Jimmy slowed the plane's spin. The aircraft shuddered violently as if protesting against his maneuvers, but somehow it obeyed. His training kicked in, muscle memory guiding him through complex aerial physics that even seasoned pilots hesitated to attempt. He remembered the words of his flight instructor. Sometimes, survival isn't about what's possible, it's about making the impossible possible. And now, in the sky over hostile territory, he lived those words. Through the haze of smoke and metal, a familiar silhouette emerged, the enemy ace, known for his ruthless tactics and cold precision. His jet sliced through the clouds with lethal speed, clearly expecting an easy kill. "Looks like dinner's ready," Jimmy whispered under his breath. But the ace didn't realize that Jimmy's desperation had sharpened his instincts into something almost superhuman. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was fighting for vengeance. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed down to gauges, crosshairs, and the enemy's looming shadow. Jimmy toggled switches, his mind calculating vectors, velocities, and trajectories. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, despite the chaos. "If I pull too hard here, I'll lose lift. But if I bank too shallow, he'll flank me. Come on," the plane responded, groaning and shivering under the stress. But it stayed airborne. Jimmy's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the engine, a single pulse of life, danger, and focus. Jimmy spotted an opening. The enemy ace banked wide, overconfident. Using a sudden surge of throttle, Jimmy dove from the clouds, approaching the ace from below. The blind spot of the enemy jet was perfect. With a single squeeze of the trigger, rounds tore through the enemy fighter. Sparks flew. The jet wobbled violently. Jimmy felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Revenge was not just a thought. It was happening in real time. But there was no time to celebrate. The plane was still gravely damaged, and every second spent in the air could be the last. With the enemy ace incapacitated, Jimmy had to navigate the crippled fighter home. Every maneuver risked ripping off the remaining wing entirely. He skimmed low over rivers to reduce drag, threading through narrow valleys to avoid radar detection. Trees and mountains loomed close, yet Jimmy flew with uncanny precision. Each second was a test of endurance, each mile a testament to human willpower. He felt the plane's pain, as if it were a living creature screaming for release. But he refused to let go. Hours of tense flying finally paid off. Through the haze, the familiar outlines of his airbase appeared. He radioed in, his voice steady but grim. "Control, this is Harker. I'm coming in." Wingless but alive. Ground crews rushed to the runway, eyes wide as they saw the damaged fighter approaching like a phantom of the sky. Jimmy's landing gear shuddered as he touched down. Dust and gravel flew, the jet skidding dangerously close to veering off the tarmac. But against all odds, it stopped, intact, victorious, and very much alive. As the engines powered down, Jimmy climbed out of the cockpit, smoke curling around him like a halo of survival. Medics checked him for injuries, and ground crews inspected the battered jet. News of his feat spread instantly through military channels and eventually across the world. Analysts, engineers, and pilots alike marveled at the feat. How had a man flown without a wing and survived? More astonishingly, how had he not only survived but exacted revenge on the pilot who thought him defeated? The story became legend and a tale of grit, skill, and an indomitable spirit. Jimmy Harker didn't just return from a fatal mission. He redefined what it meant to fight. His story inspired a generation of pilots, soldiers, and ordinary people alike. The lesson was clear. When faced with insurmountable odds, determination and ingenuity can bend reality itself. Even in a machine designed for death, even in a world dictated by physics and enemy fire, the human spirit can find a path where none seems possible. Jimmy's courage wasn't just in flying a broken plane. It was in refusing to surrender to fear, chaos, or fate. As Jimmy fought to control the crippled fighter, memories of his early flight training flashed through his mind. He remembered the grueling hours in simulators, the endless drills on emergency maneuvers, and the lectures on aerodynamics and engine failure. If you lose a wing, you don't just give up. his instructor had said. You improvise, adapt, and survive. Those words, once theoretical, had become his lifeline. Every adjustment he made now, twisting, banking, throttling, was a direct result of countless hours of preparation. Survival, he realized, was the sum of experience and instinct, sharpened under pressure. The sky became a battlefield of motion and chaos. Enemy jets swarmed around him, thinking he was easy prey. But Jimmy's mind was razor sharp. He calculated the trajectory of each incoming missile, the speed of every opponent jet, and the limits of his own failing aircraft. The plane groaned with every sudden maneuver, metal flexing in protest, instruments flickering erratically. Each movement was a gamble with death, a delicate dance in which one wrong step would send him plummeting into the earth. Yet somehow, he managed to thread the needle, turning near catastrophe into controlled chaos. With one wing gone, Jimmy knew brute force was no longer an option. Instead, he relied on strategy, patience, and the element of surprise. Diving behind a thick layer of clouds, he vanished from enemy radar. His remaining wing provided just enough lift for subtle adjustments, and his engine became both motor and rudder. From this precarious position, he picked off enemy fighters one by one, exploiting their overconfidence. The skies, once his hunter's domain, had become his arena. His mastery of physics, aerodynamics, and battlefield psychology was now on full display. Inside the cockpit, Jimmy spoke softly, partly to calm himself, partly as a running commentary. Stay steady. You can do this. Don't stall. His voice echoed against the walls of metal and glass, a mantra against fear. Sweat dripped down his brow, blurring the edges of his vision, but his mind remained sharp. He adjusted the throttle, banking carefully to compensate for the missing wing, eyes scanning every movement in the sky. He wasn't just surviving, he was orchestrating a symphony of aerial maneuvers, using the damaged aircraft as both weapon and shield. The infamous enemy ace returned, a shadow of death slicing through the clouds with deadly precision. He had underestimated Jimmy once, but this time he was cautious, eyes scanning for any irregular movement. Jimmy waited, calculating the perfect strike. In a sudden burst of speed, he dove from above using gravity and engine, thrust to generate the speed his missing wing could no longer provide. The ace's jet, caught off guard, buckled under a precise attack. Smoke trailed behind it as it spiraled downward, leaving Jimmy victorious but acutely aware that his fight wasn't over yet. He still had to survive the journey home. Flying at low altitudes over rugged terrain, Jimmy used nature itself as a tool. Valleys shielded him from radar detection. Forests offered a chance to glide without exposure, and rivers reflected sunlight to temporarily blind enemy trackers. But nature was also unforgiving. Gusts of wind threatened to destabilize the aircraft. Mountains loomed dangerously close, and every maneuver risked catastrophe. With nerves of steel and unwavering focus, Jimmy threaded through the obstacles, turning a landscape of danger into a path toward survival. Hours felt like days as Jimmy approached his base. Fatigue clawed at him, every muscle screaming for relief. Yet he remained hyper-aware. The tarmac ahead seemed impossibly small for a plane in its state. Yet he trusted his instincts. Ground crews had rushed to the perimeter, eyes wide with disbelief as the aircraft glided toward them, missing a wing but holding together. Dust, sparks, and smoke filled the air as the plane skidded to a rough stop. Silence followed for a heartbeat, then eruptions of cheers. Jimmy Harker had done the impossible. Once safely on the ground, Jimmy's survival and heroics became a symbol of courage and ingenuity. Military analysts studied the flight. Engineers marveled at the structural resilience of the aircraft, and fellow pilots looked on in awe. Orders of commendation, interviews, and recountings followed, but Jimmy remained humble. For him, survival had never been about glory. It had been about living to continue the fight, to protect comrades, and to face an enemy head-on no matter the odds. Jimmy Harker's story became more than a tale of survival. It became a lesson in human resilience, the power of preparation, and the value of composure under extreme stress. Losing a wing was no longer a death sentence. It was a challenge, one that could be met with ingenuity, courage, and willpower. For every pilot who heard his story, and every person who faced impossible odds, Jimmy's flight offered a clear message. The mind and spirit can bend reality when the body. Lieutenant Jimmy Harker's story is more than a tale of survival. It is a testament to the limits of human courage, determination, and ingenuity. Against impossible odds, he flew a crippled fighter, faced death head-on, and struck back at those who thought him defeated. His wingless flight remained